in June 2024, South Korea joined US and Japan in the first trilateral Freedom Edge military exercise. So, I mean, this is extremely, you would think, conflicting for South Koreans, the population. Can you give us sort of insight into how the people in South Korea feel about this US military push? And also, what, in your opinion, is US's agenda here?
Sure. I mean, I think like to try to understand like what is South Korean public's kind of like understanding, it's important to understand that in many regards, South Korea is a US creation in many ways. You know, it's a controversial statement to make, but if you look at the history, I think a lot of people think, oh, the Korean War must be like the US Civil War, you know, like, oh, there's these like communists and there's the capitalists and they all had different cultures and you know, the North Koreans must have always been like that, and South Koreans must have always been like that, and they went to war because, you know, different societies, different interests. It's like, no, it's nothing like that. Korea was arbitrarily divided by the United States in 1945, and 5 years later, it went into war. So there is no like 300 years where separate institutions and cultures in whatever form. What happened was the United States came in, and after Japan left, and basically propped up the Japanese collaborators in the southern side. And despite the fact that there were these burgeoning democratic movements, there was something called like people's committees that were rising up and like worker unions and peasant unions. There were all these things that together came into something called the Korea People's Republic. You know, the United States didn't care about any of that. All they saw was that, hey, look, there's this reviled minority of Japanese collaborators or those that collaborated with the Japanese. And basically, they could be like the collaborators for us, for the United States. And in effect, South Korean history was very heavily shaped by that. Like before the Korean War happened, the left was almost completely wiped out. Like tens of thousands of people were just like gathered up and just like shot in the back of the head and just dumped into a ditch. So you're talking about like in many regards, I think it's Bruce Cummings that says that there really was no basis for this US vision of like capitalist democracy in South Korea, right? Because most South Koreans were just like poor peasants, that didn't care about private property. So in that regard, a lot of people say it was the experience of the Korean War that actually made possible like the authoritarian anti-communism that took place that shaped a lot of like South Korean consciousness. I mean, South Korea, even as of today, has something called a national security law that basically says that if you say certain things about North Korea, or if you meet somebody from North Korea, you could end up in prison, right? And of course, it's enforced at different moments based on whether the president is liberal or the president is like conservative. It's kind of like enforced in different levels, but we still live in a society where your career and your political career or your life can be destroyed by being red baited, you know? And part of it is that's just because that is South Korea. I mean, it's not to say that there's not been resistance. It's not to say that there's not been a left. It's not been to say that there's been moments where progressives and the left were strong and where they pushed back hard, but it's to say that they never were able to get rid of it. Like getting rid of it would be getting rid of the national security law. And even presidents that were lawyers that defended democratization activists that were being prosecuted for this law, even they didn't do anything about this national security law. So I think perhaps more than how much this national security law is enforced being important, it's more about the fact that it just cannot be taken out. The vestige of it still remains, right? And this is like a law that was created under Japanese colonialism. This law still remains to this day. And that's wild, right? And I think to some degree that gives you a glimpse both into what the South Korean public mind is and what it is limited by. So when you ask like, how do they understand it? I think South Koreans, to one way or another, we just had to get used to living in this kind of like constant tension. Like you can't be bothered and like shocked every time like North Korea like shoots a missile or whatever, right? But what's interesting is that that doesn't mean that it's not taking a toll on people's minds, that is not on people's minds, right? I think last year sometime there was a false alarm where North Korea had launched a rocket and they were saying that debris was falling into Seoul. And of course, it just created a massive, like it just had a huge impact, right? Everybody was just like, shaken. And then later it was like, oh, it was a false alarm. They didn't shoot it across anywhere in that trajectory, right? So yeah, I don't know. I think that there is something that is shaping the consciousness. So I guess as regards to your question, it's like, how do they see it? I think in many ways, the imagination of South Koreans is like limited. And it's limited because the bounds of thinkable thought are restricted, like legally and socially to some degree. And I think to some degree, at different moments, I think the South Korean public has reacted differently to the US military, right? When the US military commits like atrocious crimes, like running over two middle school girls on a tank and then being scot-free, getting off scot-free, or when it commits rapes and, when all these kind of like nasty behavior that US military does, right? When those things happen, of course, the Korean public's mind is like, shoots up. But the Korean mind is also like impacted by, in effect, being a country that was shaped by the United States. I mean, the US military has been here the whole life of South Korea. And the US has been South Korea's older brother or so-called older brother its whole life. It's not like 10 years. It's literally since its birth. It was there. It was there when it was born and it's here still now. So that does something to people's psyche.